Hello everyone and welcome to this Gaming Democracy webinar. It is great to see you all virtually this evening. Just like to start by introducing myself. My name is Joseph Dunne-Howrie. I'm one of the investigators on this project based at Bruford College, and I lead this project with Tom Drayton. Hello, Tom.
Sorry, I just had to unmute there. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all, and really excited to be sort of starting off this project with Joe and our great guest speakers today as well.
Yes, so let's welcome them. Let's welcome Wes. Hello, Wes, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Hopefully you can see and hear me now.
Yes, that's all good. And Ashton, hello.
Hello. Oh, my camera's gone off again. Hello,
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. So to people joining, it's lovely to have you here. Just let you know, the internet's a little bit patchy. We're not quite sure which end it is. It's probably mine. So if anything freezes, don't worry, it will unfreeze. So to business. Let's give you a quick rundown of the schedule. We're going to keep it fairly casual, but in a moment Tom and I are going to give a quick presentation about the Gaming Democracy Project, a little bit of background information, particularly around what these webinars are trying to achieve within the research network, which I'll talk about a little bit more, which Wes and Ashton are part of, because this is the first of 3 webinars. I'll give more details about those later in the evening. Then after Tom and I have spoken, we're going to hand over to Wes and Ashton, who have been given a provocation, and they're going to share that provocation. They're going to share their responses to that provocation. And we're going to talk to them about how they come at this topic from gamification, far right, digital culture, etc. And what their dialogue was like together, because they did this together, because they both come from different disciplines. Wes works in theatre and performance, and Ashton is a criminologist. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion, a round table, and then we'll go into a Q&A for the last half hour. So do please use the chat function. We want that to be nice and lively. So Tom, let's go into our presentation. So I'm going to start screen sharing now. Tell me, is that showing okay?
Great.
Great. So I'll just start. So just tell me when to click, Tom.
It's just doing its little worry blur. Perfect. Great. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Really excited to get this project off the ground. The idea of the Gaming Democracy Project is to bring together a wide variety of artists, academics and activists to investigate how participatory performance, social media and democracy interact with contemporary political and online landscapes. And the idea of this is that in direct contrast to the online gamification of conflict by the far right through the use of memes, role play and alternative world building, what we want to explore as part of the Gaming Democracy Network is the untapped potential for more egalitarian and progressive forms of online and on-stage political engagement.
So through collaborative conversations and experiments, such as the one we're having now, between a variety of creatives and researchers, the project aims to develop new interdisciplinary perspectives and ways of working together. With Web 2.0 becoming an engine of radicalization, how can we combat fascist and white supremacist ideologies through investigating and participating in alternative political realities built from the fields of political science, game design, and interactive theatre? So each webinar in this series brings together a pair of creatives and researchers from diverse disciplines in order to discover useful intersections in their respective fields. Through a public conversation, we offer a space to explore and discuss these issues, to build on these initial connections, and to open up an ongoing dialogue.
And the idea behind this is we've got 3 main questions underpinning our own interest in this, me and Joe. The first question would be, how do far-right movements radicalize people through gameplay? So by gameplay, what we refer to is the online gamification of conflict by the far right through the use of memes, storytelling, role play, and alternative world building that also bleeds into what you might call the real world. So examples of this for us include the internet message board based far-right QAnon conspiracy theory, in which commenters contribute to an ever-expanding lore centered around a fictional White House insider, providing access to secret documents that reveal that Donald Trump is actively working to take down a satanic baby-eating cabal of pedophiles at the heart of government, directly contributing to the January 2021 Capitol riots in the US, so bleeding into quite violently real life. Another example of this would be the emergence of online group Generation Identity, also known as GI, as a real-world pan-European political youth movement who promote a white nationalist remigration platform leading to the March 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand. And another example would be the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terror Chief's recent report this year warning that British children are being, quote, lured into extreme right-wing terrorism with online content based on violent video games shaped to indoctrinate them, end quote. So the idea is, by bringing together a series of experts in the field of radicalization, online participation, and far-right structures, we aim to find out if a line can be drawn between methods of online gameplay and real-world violence. This will include investigations into how social media platforms, online message boards, and virtual reality are used as gameplay tools by the far right for recruitment and radicalization.
The second question is, how do the storytelling structures of interactive and participatory theatre, both online and on stage, emulate the immersion of such gameplay? So we use the word interactive and participatory theatre specifically over immersive performance practice in response to the appropriation of immersive performance practices and just that terminology by large corporations. In its popular form, immersive theatre promises audience agency, but in effect it offers a weak perception of agency in its engagement. And if anyone's interested in that, I was one of the co-authors of the post-immersive manifesto, where we go into more detail about the kind of the politics and the value of immersion in the context of neoliberalism. But by focusing on participatory theatre practices, we refer to the term post-immersive with regard to a return to immersive theatre's radical origins in the pursuit of intimacy, authentic engagement, and collective agency. And both Tom and I know the directors of ZU UK, so a lot of that kind of critical underpinning is drawn from their work and my work with them as a researcher. So the Gaming Democracy Research Network brings together a variety of theatre makers, companies and artists who engage with different modes of interactive theatre and gameplay within their practice. And by sharing practical aspects of their methodologies with members throughout the network, we aim to investigate the interrelatedness between the sense of immersion generated through the online gamification utilised by the far right, and the gameplay systems utilised by performance makers both on stage and online. So this sharing of practice will manifest eventually in the form of interdisciplinary workshops within the network, public sharings, and online seminars, which we will make public next year.
The third question that underpins what we're aiming to do with this project is how can gameplay theatre model new egalitarian and progressive forms of democratic participation in resistance to the far right during this era of crisis capitalism? So whilst we recognise the dangers of unregulated and unmonitored digital spaces acting as terrain for political extremists to operate unimpeded, we do not propose to subscribe to a pre-lapsarian anti-internet position, but we believe that gameplay theatre, as an example of a hybrid art form representative of the convergence of media associated with digital culture, has this potential to act as a space where new forms of democratic participation can be rehearsed and experimented with. The ability for participants to collaborate in the building of fictional worlds with artists in these events has the potential to be adapted into new forms of political dialogue that stimulate empathy and mitigate against feelings of resentment and anger. So the goal of this discussion and these discussions going forward is to afford our participants a significantly enhanced form of agency within a political discourse that is practiced as alternative world building in gameplay theatre. So in this sense, our whole project is rooted in the political reality of the present world in order to build an alternative conception of its future by embedding the seeds of transformation in it. The crisis of capitalism that we refer to describes the post-2008 epoch where alternative futures have been colonized by defunct present epistemes of security and freedom, which we want to sort of disrupt and play around with and engage with.
And I should say as well, the reason that you're looking at Operation Black Antler is one of the early inspirations for me for this project. I'll let everyone look at that piece, but it's an extraordinary piece of interactive theatre, the absolute antithesis of the kind of immersion we're working against. So to the webinar. So Tom and I set Ashton and Wes these questions and provocations and just said, you can do whatever you want with them. We just want you to come up with some sort of response. And that once you've done that, have a discussion between you without me and Tom to see how you approach them, to identify how that interdisciplinary dialogue might be built on and capitalized upon. So first question, how is digital technology changing how we experience political participation? If the web is an engine of radicalization, how is this shaped by user participation? And what role do online games, social media and message boards have in the process of alternative world building? So stop the share there and let's go to our panel. So Wes, if we start with you, and just before you pull up your screen, if you could just tell us a little bit about you and where your professional background and also what your interest in all this work is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Tom. This is the one bit of this evening that I hadn't prepared, speaking about about myself in an introductory way. So let me try and do this a little bit off the cuff. My name's Andrew Westerside. I go by Wes. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a theatre maker and theatre scholar, theatre academic based at the University of Lincoln. I have been part of a company called Prototype Theatre for, 15 years, 13, 14, 15 years now. And we make increasingly, or I would say maybe for the past 7 or 8 years, increasingly kind of contemporary, politically engaged works of experimental performance and or new theatre. That's kind of one hat that I'm here with. As an academic researcher, my research work for the past 7 or 8 years has been engaged with video games, game studies, and games design. And more recently, I've been working with human-computer interaction, and for the past 2 years, working with the GTP3 artificial intelligence architecture and a project on computational creativity, which I hope in some ways kind of starts to answer the question of why I'm interested in these kinds of things. I suppose that what this project does for me a little bit is it kind of stitches together a number of the different hats I wear. That as a theatre maker, I am making performance that is engaged broadly with kind of political or big geopolitical ideas. As a researcher, I'm interested in kind of computational power, computational propaganda, computational creativity, and they're those kind of more, I guess, kind of academy-led research projects that I work with, and in some sense, this stitches those two things together. So I'm really excited, simply, I suppose, at the very, very outset, to see where this is all going to go, because I know. I'm sure the feeling isn't mutual, but listening to Ashton was absolutely fascinating. Like the conversations that we've had, and we've met twice now to discuss what we're going to present tonight. And I just find the different approaches, and especially the kind of field work that someone like Ashton is doing in her work, absolutely fascinating. And I think there's probably quite a rich seam of conversation and collaboration to come from all of these. And one of the things that we spoke about was how the group felt truly interdisciplinary in a really, really interesting way.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Wes. So let's go into your presentation.
Fantastic. Okay, 1 second. I'm now going to do that kind of slowing down of speech while I look at pressing the play button on my slideshow. And the first thing I've done is press play on my slideshow and then realize that doesn't actually share my screen automatically, and that I have to do that myself.
Lockdown, we still can't do Zoom. We'll be 18 months.
I know. Okay, I'm going to share this and hope that you can see it. If that's a thumbs up, great. Okay. All right then. Yes, so hello everybody. A huge thanks to Joe and Tom for inviting me to be a part of this, and for Ashton for being so collegiate in our meetings and having such kind of interesting chats. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about how we might want to order this, and we felt that me going first was the best way round, especially as I think you'll probably see the case studies that Ashton's going to talk about in a little while are absolutely fascinating. And I think that really amazing work will quite rightly and quite properly, I think, kind of shape many of the discussion points that are going to follow afterwards. But before that, there's one idea in particular that I want to focus on because it's something that resonates with me as a theatre maker who engages a lot with questions of process. That is, you know, how cultural artifacts are made, by whom, how they work, how is it that they do what they do. And my hope is then that this will have some broader relevance to the wider project and the network. And it felt to Ashton and I in discussion that in going first like this, we wanted to kind of stay quite broad. We wanted to just open out some conversation. So I hope that's exactly what we'll do. These are the prompts that we were given. I've ever so slightly shown Joan up there, Joe, because he gave us 5 prompts, not 3. I put them there because I think, again, it might be kind of helpful in shaping the direction of our conversation afterwards. And I think what I'm going to say responds to 2 of those areas. So how people create and/or are given identities that conform to political beliefs and ideologies, and the relationship between the technological infrastructure of games and the ethics of a player's decision-making process through a story. And the concept I'm going to use to kind of try and crack that particular nut in about 8 minutes is the idea of procedural rhetoric. And I imagine this will be a super common concept to any colleagues who are here from game studies, but I'm aware that we're quite a broad-ranging group of disciplines here, so I'm just going to frame it a little bit. So it's a concept developed by Ian Bogost in Persuasive Games. It's now a 15-year-old book, but still an incredibly important piece of work. And I think it's an idea really central to what this group is thinking about more broadly. And I'll share a quick extract to hopefully give a clearer flavour of what procedural rhetoric really means. So Bogost says, as cultural critics, we can interrogate literature, art, film, and daily life for the underlying processes they trace. But computational procedurality places a greater emphasis on the expressive capacity afforded by rules of execution. Computers run processes that invoke interpretations of processes in the real world. So procedural rhetoric is essentially this idea that the computational architecture of a game, specifically in terms of agency, choice, rule, structure, can have highly persuasive properties, which brings us back round, I hope, to these broader themes that are being explored across all of these webinars of democracy and political ideology, because the notion of procedural rhetoric, I think, is a really useful way of understanding games as cultural and indeed political objects, which have the capacity to function as a kind of Trojan horse for these emerging forms of propaganda and computational propaganda that have been sweeping across increasingly digital democracies over the last decade. I think one of the clearest or most straightforward examples of procedural rhetoric in action is in this game. It's called September the 12th, A Toy World by Gonzalo Frasca, and some of you may know it. It should be noted for the record that Gonzalo Frasca says this is very much not a game. He insists that it isn't a game, and coined the term news game to try and kind of separate it out, I suppose. If you've ever encountered it, you'll know that it's very much engaged with the subject of military intervention in the Middle East. But how is it an example of procedural rhetoric? So hopefully this is the drum roll moment, because I do have some video, and I'm just going to start playing it. And it looks like it's working. So the object of the experience, let's call it an experience, is to use the cursor or targeter, and you should be able to see that in the video now. It's that kind of little circular kind of crosshair moving around, to fire rockets at what we might assume are local insurgents. Now, the important part, there is no way in September 12th that you can fire a rocket without causing massive collateral damage. You'll see one's just been fired there, and it's just leveled all of those buildings. So you can't fire a rocket in this game without causing huge collateral damage to the buildings, the homes, the lovely little fountains, the market stalls that are all dotted around. There's another one gone. Now, this isn't because you're aiming poorly. It's not that there is a particular way that you can, for the want of a better phrase, snipe the people that you're looking for. It's not an issue of gamer skill. The computational aspect of the game is designed that way. And therefore, in that way, the procedures of the game take on that persuasive aspect. And in this case, a persuasive case about the impacts of US military intervention in the Middle East. There is no scoreboard. There is no further objective. It's almost simulation-based because it has no end. And also it has no end in time. It also has no end in space. You can scroll up and down infinitely across this kind of virtual space and just fire your rockets and wreak destruction on the buildings and the people therein. And every time I come across this now, I always feel a kind of eerie sense of foreshadowing in that kind of isometric design that the game's used, and its relation to kind of footage that would come 7 years later from WikiLeaks, this kind of collateral murder footage, which is from the viewpoint of an American Apache helicopter firing on unarmed civilians. And then here's a similar take on that kind of isometric gunner view in Call of Duty. And what you're seeing in that bottom right image is a player getting a kill streak bonus. So where after acquiring a certain number of kills or points, you get to operate a gun on the side of an attack helicopter. And I suppose I'm just kind of clustering those together in terms of images that kind of resonate for me in a particular way. And I've also got, I want to talk about some examples of games that I think already exist that are, I suppose, exploiting procedural rhetoric, not only to make very clear political points, but also doing them in kind of an interesting, potentially egalitarian, potentially kind of progressive way, which makes me think about some of the things that Tom was talking about in the opening. So Lucas Pope's Papers, Please is one example that very much engages the players in through its kind of computational procedurality with the humanitarian and nationalistic tensions at play in border control policy. The Stanley Parable, which is a brilliant, truly brilliant piece of metafiction that uses process and procedure in very foregrounded ways to ruminate on happiness and work and lots of other things too. And then I suppose at the other end of that, kind of more a AAA end of that spectrum, is something like 6 Days in Fallujah. So this is a game that was supposed to be released actually 13 years ago. It was supposed to come out in 2009, developed and published by Konami. And ever since then, publishers and developers have picked it up and put it down, and it's been protested against and campaigned against and now it's back on the menu for a Q4 release this year. But it kind of does what it says on the tin as a game. It is a kind of survival horror, is how the publishers are kind of calling it, where you kind of go through the 1st Battalion 6 days in Fallujah in Iraq in 2004. And as you can imagine, lots of the protest around that was from, I think the Stop the War Coalition was a big part of kind of protesting the initial release of the game. American military veterans were against publication of the game. And of course, the proof will be very much in the pudding with this version of 6 days, because it's not out yet. But there's been lots of promise of particularly impressive destructible environments, which is a computational procedure that has a kind of persuasive aspect. The AI enemies behaving in ways that are, and I'm going to put this in massive quotation marks, accurate. And examples of that are about the kind of guerrilla warfare tactics that were practiced in those kind of Fallujah back streets. So instead of kind of encountering American forces head on, they will kind of hide in doorways and come at you with knives, a lot of kind of last minute kind of guerrilla inner city urban tactics. So the AIs are designed to behave in a particular way. So there's lots of things that suggest with 6 days that there's going to be really interesting from a kind of computational procedural standpoint. Lots of that kind of persuasive architecture will be baked in. And that's a very particular position on Iraq in 2004. So I think that's a kind of another good example that's not even out yet, but kind of from perhaps a different end of a political spectrum, but one that's taking a very particular view on the American military in that space. And handily, the cathedral clock is going off, which means it's almost time for me to finish. And I will finish by kind of circling all the way back round to theatre work, I suppose, and say that as a theatre maker, what interests me about procedural rhetoric as a way of explaining how games do what they do at a computational level is that it makes me think very much about the processes of theatre making and how forms of theatre where audience members have agency might also have or be designed to have these kinds of procedural rhetorics built in. So I'm thinking about, work like Lies by Antrora and Goed, who, for anyone who doesn't know them, they're a kind of Belgian theatre and performance company. And in this particular performance, the audience are divided up across these casino tables, and each table represents a country. And then your country's currency is represented by poker chips, and every person at the table represents a bank. So there is a game being played here, and therefore there is a kind of set of rules and executables that exist, all of which have the potential to have persuasive properties. So throughout the game, the stakes get higher and higher, as you might imagine. And when the market crashes, as it inevitably does in every kind of iteration of the playthrough. So there you go, there's a kind of procedural rhetoric there, that the game will always lead to a market crash. The room has to make a decision. Everyone kind of turns their chairs inwards, and that you can see just about at the top center of the image, this kind of central game board. The room then has to make a decision about which countries go under, who gets bailed out, and so on. So the audience kind of turn in, and this kind of gamified political discourse begins. So I think across lots of different kinds of theatre, performance, art practice, like the work of Antrora and Goed, like right the way down to things like the kind of audio, agency-driven audio walks by Janet Cardiff and George Burroughs-Miller, the work of a kind of incredible kind of theatre, mixed media, digital, gaming company, Fast Familiar, who have this kind of tremendous kind of back catalogue of works that are scratching the surface of so many different ideas in so many interesting ways. I think there's lots of potential when you're structuring rule-based interaction, or even not, it could be even more kind of thematically driven than that, to think about what it is that is procedurally persuasive in those works. I think it's a really good, I feel like it's a really good kind of tool in your toolbox to think about and interrogate that kind of the computational architecture of the game and how it might be politically persuasive. I have gone over, Ashton, by about 1 minute, 10 seconds, so I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you.
Thanks, Wes. That's fantastic. So much to talk about there, but yeah, we'll come back to that. So, Ashton, if you just say, before you go into your presentation, could you just give a quick...
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen to check it works.
Okay. Yeah, we can see that.
I take it everyone can see this.
Yeah.
You've frozen, Joe, so yeah. Okay, hi, my name's Ashton. I just completed my PhD in January. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Southampton, and my work focuses around the visual components of radicalization. So I spent 4 years undercover in different far-right networks. Previously to that, I spent about 8 months undercover inside Islamic State, and I look at cultural criminology, which I'm going to talk about a bit in the presentation, the way that history is weaponized to fuel far-right narratives, and the way that technology acts as an accelerator of radicalization. So as Wes was leading to in his presentation, this is actually one of the most impressive interdisciplinary networks that I've seen. And I was saying, I really hope that they do some sort of funding bid or something one day, because it is such an experience to be around so many different disciplines and scholars looking at the same thing. So my presentation, don't hate the game, hate the player. So I have never subscribed to the idea that video games radicalize people, nor have I subscribed to the idea that the internet radicalizes people. I think they can be accelerators, but I don't think they're the cause. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the research that I've done in this presentation. So just a quick plug, I am part of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network. So if you're interested in gaming and radicalizations, definitely check them out. They have some amazing people in this network doing incredible research. So definitely go on Twitter and look at that. I am a cultural criminologist by heart. So that means that we view terrorism and extremism to be a cultural product and creative construct. I have lost my mouse. So propaganda needs to be analysed in relation to the subcultural meanings that it carries. I'm going to talk about that as we go through the presentation today. So what I really look at is the reasons behind people joining extremist groups or getting involved with extremism from the kind of foreground factors. So when I started with Islamic State, it was all about people joined ISIS because it was sexy. They were offering something that was seductive. My thesis is called Seductions of the Caliphate. So people were joining because they offered something that they wanted, that they lacked in their current everyday lives. And it's very similar to the far right, which I'm hoping this presentation will show a bit about. So video games and radicalization have been around for a long time. So this is a 2006 video game, Quest for Bush, that was released by Al-Qaeda. You can imagine the kind of narrative that is going on here, very old school. We also see these kind of issues arising in games like Medal of Honor, when you can play as the Taliban. So this was the huge controversy around this video game. Why should you be allowed to play as an insurgent force? What are the dangers of this? What is this causing people to think about themselves? And a lot of this was compared to the kind of militaristic aspects that come with video games when they are used to train, particularly in the American military. We also have games like Syrian warfare. So this is essentially, you can play as Russia, you can play as Syria, and you are fighting either ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and then Special Forces, which is a Hezbollah released video game. So the links between video games and potential radicalization have been around for a long time. It's recently, with the rise of some of the things we're going to talk about in this presentation, that it's become more of a concern in relation to security aspects, in particular in relation to extremism and terrorism. So when we're talking about gamification, one of the most popular examples that I've seen everywhere is this idea that ISIS have their own version of Grand Theft Auto, right? I see this all the time coming up in articles. My students talk about it quite a lot. This is completely untrue. They do not have their own version of GTA. This is segments that they have taken from the way that they have manipulated general Grand Theft Auto games. So it might be them flying a plane into a tower, might be them doing a vehicle ramming, a stabbing, a shooting, and they clip these stills together to create propaganda videos that they can then accelerate out and pummel out on social media to make it seem like they have these video games. The reason that they use this is because obviously they are trying to attract a certain type of person. And as I say that, I want to give a warning that the rest of this presentation is going to contain some propaganda. None of it is designed to be dangerous or insidious, but I'm just going to warn you that I'm going to show you some propaganda. So GTA is one of the most kind of commonplace narratives. I'm hoping this is going to play. I don't even know if you can hear that.
We can't hear it, Ashton, but we can see it.
Okay. I'll listen to the nasheed by myself. It's fine. I'll explain when it's finished. Yeah, so the reason that I show that is because one of the things I'm quite interested in is machinima. So the ways that people will mod out games that already exist. This is Arma 3. It's a really popular one. You see this a lot with the far right as well, particularly with like Crusader Kings. I'm going to talk about Assassin's Creed a bit later, but you see the way that they will adapt and mod these video games so that you can play as ISIS, you can seem to be a part of a particular group. You have Al-Qaeda ones as well. It's really interesting when you're looking at radicalization, and particularly with gaming, when people are doing this, to differentiate between who's just having a bit of piss about with their friends and who is actually engaging in serious hate speech with a clear motive. So these are some of the things that I would look at when I'm thinking about those kind of things. With ISIS as well, they shoot their propaganda in a really serious way to emulate video games. So they often have these kill scenes like you would see in Mortal Kombat. Another thing they do is they shoot their videos in first person shooter footage. This is super popular with ISIS videos because they're trying to attract a certain caliber of people, right? They know that people play these games, they're going to resonate with this kind of stuff. That's going to lead them more into being attracted to this kind of narrative that they're selling, these roles that they can play as a fighter, as a warrior, all about camaraderie, joining this brotherhood, the things that they might lack or want to kind of seek out, these kind of quests for significance that they have in their everyday life. This is all enforced through this kind of propaganda. And we see this as well with more contemporarily, the Christchurch shooter. So anyone that's had the displeasure of watching the Christchurch shooter video will know that it is shot incredibly similarly to a video game. The way that he is carrying his gun, even the way that he picks up his weapons reminds me so much of like when I used to play James Bond on the N64, like just the way that he's bending down to pick up the weapons, very similar. And the relationship in terms of gaming and the Christchurch shooting, they've had copycat games made where you can play as the Christchurch shooter. You can have avatars of him. In terms of gamification, this is one of the most prevalent terrorist attacks, in my opinion, in relation to this particular phenomenon. When I'm thinking about gaming, I generally, as part of the research network, look at the relationship between gaming and propaganda. So there's different examples that I'm going to use now. One of them is Wolfenstein 2. So Wolfenstein has been around for a long time. Those of you that know your Nazi history will know it sort of emulates Wewelsburg Castle, right? So the SS Spiritual Center. With this particular game, like the way that the propaganda was put out when the game was released, I was explaining to Wes, like I didn't have a example in the slides, so I didn't think it would work. But when they released this on Twitter, they actually had like the video slot and then hashtag no more Nazis. So they're like capitalize on the contemporary political climate to be able to sell and attract people to their video games. But again, the far right will just manipulate the game for their own kind of advantage and the narratives that they're trying to put out. And this is one of the issues that I have with these links between radicalization and video games. So Red Dead Redemption 2 was another game I was like really into a few years ago when I was studying this, because there was so much controversy around the misogynistic elements around the suffragette video. And also those of you that have played it will know that the Klan appear in there. There's lots of violent fantasies that you can act out. So many things that have been cut and manipulated as propaganda. But this is not scripted part of the game, right? These are open world games and people can do what they want with the information they're presented with. So when people are attacking suffragettes, I've seen videos of her being like hogtied, fed to alligators. This is probably one of the most famous ones where they were punching her. This is not part of the game. You do not have to do this when you play the game. This is people doing it off their own accord and then making videos of it and then pushing that out as propaganda. And similarly to that, I look at the ways in which video games are used within meme culture. So looking at the visual components, I'm basically obsessed with memes. I deconstruct them constantly. Two of the most famous kind of far right ones, you've got the God of War reenactment. This is Luca Traini. He's a far right terrorist from Italy. A lot of people will kind of intertwine his image with this video games to reinforce this idea of masculinity, this savior of the white race, sticking up for people, this knight in shining armor narrative. We also see Trump all the time in Warhammer 40,000 memes constantly as the God Emperor protecting civilization, not from aliens invading the galaxy, but reinforcing his anti-immigration, zero tolerance rhetoric, right? So he's standing up for civilization against this new enemy, warping this and pushing it out within meme culture. Because again, people that want to attract people to certain groups know that video games, memes are the ways in which people are going to resonate. The other thing that I look at is artwork and the ways in which specific video game artwork is used as propaganda. So I've got two examples. One that I've written about more extensively is Far Cry 5. Now, this was like a huge controversy when it came out for the fact that generally Far Cry tends to avoid any kind of real world political scenarios when they do their games. But this came out at such a bizarre time. It was so in line with the kind of rise of the alt-right, the ways in which the kind of Eden's Gate doomsday prepper cult was portrayed, very similar to the Branch Davidians and Waco, very similar to the Bundys. This kind of charismatic Christian doomsday prepper leader basically thriving off of his followers. You've got gun control, gun culture in there. You've got the kind of Eurochrist, which kind of represents the rise of the religious right in the age of Trump and the fact that he attracted so many followers under that umbrella. So there's so many things in Far Cry that were used in propaganda, but then it was also used by the far left as well to kind of say, look what you're doing, look who you are, you're just the same as these people. So it's really interesting to me how they use artwork in propaganda. The other example that I have, and actually I think Siraj is in the call now, and I'm working on this with him and my supervisor. So I'm really interested as a historian in what we call alt history. So this is the alt-right version and manipulation of history. So how the alt-right will weaponize certain epochs, mainly the Middle Ages, the Vikings, anything to do with antiquity, to propel this idea that we need to go back to these civilizations that were pure as an example to create our ethno-states that will thrive in the future. Now, they will cling on to the far right absolutely anything that they can to prove that this particular civilization is superior, and they will use loose and cherry-picked interpretations of history to support this. So we see with Assassin's Creed franchises, particularly with the Vikings and Valhalla, with Odyssey and Sparta, ancient Rome, these are the classic epochs that they will pick up on and propel out constantly to reinforce their idea that we need to build back these ancient civilizations in which white races were dominant, pure, and basically the best thing that anyone could ever aspire to. So you see this a lot in propaganda with particular video games being used as artwork. And then the final example that I have, I spent quite a lot of time on different gaming platforms. These are the main ones. I'm going to talk about VR chat, which if you haven't been in, it's friggin' weird. You basically jump in and out of servers into random real world party scenarios. I was in a Nazi dinner party once. It was very strange. These are some of the people that were there. Hitler, the Klan, Anders Breivik, that's the Norway shooter. You will basically jump in and out of these particular servers, and they will just be other completely insane people having casual conversations in Vivo. I believe at this we were in Vivelsberg Castle, but they also have different military bases as well. Now, the reason that I think this is so interesting for people looking at radicalization is it's so difficult to police live chat, so difficult. If you're monitoring potential extremists, you can scrape their data, their conversations, you can look at their images. Trying to get these bizarre conversations of what they're talking about is super difficult. You have to spend a lot of time creating false identities to even be allowed into these kind of servers. So it's super difficult to police that. So I think when we get into more and more advanced technologies, particularly in terms of VR, AI, things like that, it's much more difficult to try and police that. So yes, that was all I had to say. I'm probably gone over, so apologies for that. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear any questions you have. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ashton. Really, really interesting. Really, lots of different things I want to pick up on in terms of that. Joe, can we ask Ashton and Wes to sort of talk a little bit about their experience, I suppose, working together? Is that our next step?
Yeah, so I think that would be nice. Just a little bit, just because you both bring. I mean, there's obviously a great deal of connections between what you've presented, but I think we just be really interested to hear just for a few moments what you observed about each other, I guess, and how you approach this topic. So Ashton, you're in a drama circle now. We do a lot of this. Welcome to the drama space. Yeah.
It's a safe space.
What's going on for you in this moment? But either of you two can start.
Do you want to? Shall I?
I'll let you start because I'm not in criminology. We don't have this like safe space debrief, so I'll let you start.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, I think everyone who just listened to that presentation will have a million and one things that they could just want to talk about forever. I suppose from my point as someone, again, this kind of hybrid theatre maker, theatre researcher, also working game studies and in HCI, I'm really interested in, especially in I suppose who the viewer is, where the lens is on the camera of lots of these videos, especially in the kind of the Christchurch work around making that an FPS. So I suppose that the scenographies of those games as designed are kind of fascinating to me. And then specifically in VR, I've done a little bit of work in VR, but mostly in kind of creating simulations for kind of commercial research purposes. But the ways in which that we get this kind of, gosh, do you remember, you're recording this, so I'll have to get the right royal now. There was a royal who was spotted wearing I think went to a fancy dress party.
It was Harry.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Was it
Harry,
Harry?
as a
yeah.
Nazi.
Okay, so Harry went to a party as a Nazi, and when I see these kind of VR experiences where you can go into these kind of either random or very private servers, I suppose I'm fascinated by, obviously in a way that isn't endorsing it, but I'm fascinated by the kind of imaginative play that is going on in those spaces. This is virtual dress up for racists, and I think there's a whole different set of performances and performativities that are going on in there. And I know Ashton was talking a lot about the difficulties actually of getting in and what happens to you as a researcher when you're exposed to it. And we had a big conversation last week, didn't we, about exposure and about what it does to you to be in that kind of space. But I'm fascinated in the creativity there somehow, or the very nascent kind of childlike creativity of, if we can't go to fancy dress parties as Nazis anymore, then we'll go to our virtual little doll's house and we'll all put on our little costumes, and we'll carry on having the conversations we would normally have on Discord or on old kind of IRC message boards. But instead, I'll talk to you and you'll be Anders Breivik, and that'll be cool, won't it? And how that then kind of impacts dialogue, how it impacts what you say, what it gives you the freedom to say, when there's a kind of political cosplaying there, and about how what that might do in, I guess, as a catalyst for radicalization. When you allow yourself to embody that virtual space, do you allow yourself to try on some new thoughts? Are you improvising text, if you like, in that context? So there's some of the things I think that from a theatre and performance perspective that I found particularly fascinating, but I could go on and I won't.
So Ashton, same question around what Wes's perspective.
Yeah, we had a long chat the other day. He was like, we had a conversation. I think that's polite for I basically just complained for about 45 minutes about my exposure to this. No, I think what you raised is really interesting. Like, I had so many more examples that I would love to show, but I would never, because it's just so offensive. But I think that it's really interesting because, like, personally for me, I feel like a lot of these people are not extremists. They don't actually believe in what the ideological worldview is of people that are hardcore neo-Nazis, right? They're pissing about with their friends and they're trying to be funny. Now, one of the things that I do with my research, in particular my articles that I write, is deconstruct things like caricatures and these kind of really over, basically humorous things that people put out to try and make people think, well, it's actually not funny though, is it? Because it's incredibly offensive to people of color or to Jewish people or things like that. And I think that's the interesting thing with gaming, being able to intersect in and decipher who is and who is not actually engaging in that worldview. And I think the interesting thing is with the performance aspect is with the far right, there's so many different roles that they kind of open up for you to be able to perform. And I always associate this with, like, what's going on with that individual's lives and looking at people with different roles that they play in their general lives, as like a husband, a son, you know, a partner, a employer, like these kind of things. When that goes awry, they're attracted to the roles that are offered by these extremist groups, which are generally masculine, warriors, chivalry, knight in shining armor, protecting poor innocent women from all of these horrendous things that they think are going on in the world. And that's what's interesting to me about the ways in which they perform in these kind of propaganda related strategies.
Yeah. Tom, did you want to
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I'm just making some notes here. Thank you so much, Ashton. It's really interesting stuff. What was really interesting for me throughout this sort of the beginning of discussion that we've had is there's almost two things going on between the topics of the presentations you've been doing and the sort of discussions you've been having in terms of the rules of a game, I suppose, working to change the players' politics, to very badly paraphrase Wes, your brilliant discussion, and then also sort of how the players can then use game as a site of performance, manipulating the rules of games in a way in order to create propaganda. And I think that was really interesting for me in terms of there's a sort of shift in terms of who's in control in certain aspects, and we're both talking about how games and the rules of games can be used to shift people's politics, and then also how you can shift the rules of games to shift people's politics as well. Who's in control in this sense? I've got a couple of things that I'd like to just personally ask some questions in particular. So what was really interesting for me, just going into what you were discussing, Ashton, in terms of, I suppose, modding of games as performance sites to come as from a strictly performative lens, it reminds me in a very going back to a simplistic way of looking at things, of watching people do sort of mods of, say, The Sims 2, where they could recreate a whole High School Musical dance set or something, or a My Chemical Romance video or whatever. And that was and it's suddenly like, this is a new form of using this game as performance. But these people are turning it into, as you say, sort of recreating or emulating masculine fighter warrior gamification, that kind of thing. I suppose there's a question here in terms of how can you use these sites of performance in different ways, I suppose. Wes, has this occurred to you in terms of, is there a way of, because I'm interested in nicking things, I suppose, and trying out things in different ways. How would we approach using modding, I suppose, or games as sites of performance in order to affect different outcomes, I suppose? Or is that too leading a question?
I don't know. Do you mean like to convince people to not have extreme views? Like, I don't believe I don't believe in de-radicalization as a concept, so I wouldn't say de-radicalization, but like, I think that it's really interesting to think about that. With me, it's all about, with propaganda like this, you have to take the original image and convey to the audience what you have to completely deconstruct that image, the history, the cultural references, the political references, the economic references, deconstruct that so the audience can see what the subliminal messaging is. Then I think you need to attack that. You need to completely cull it down, completely disseminate it, and then reconstruct what's actually happening so that ordinary people can understand why this message is propaganda, what its political intention was, and then potentially, hopefully, think rationally for themselves that maybe there's a different alternative way of looking at it. In terms of like using games for this particular purpose, like, I'm not convinced that it will work like 100%. I know that Siraj is in the chat. I don't know if he wants to jump in on this because we've discussed this, but I'm not 100% convinced that you can use games as de-radicalization. I think that maybe in the future with a lot of work, maybe, but no.
I mean, I'm certainly not going to respond and tell Ashton that she's wrong, certainly as the expert in this field, but it does make me think about, Tom, it makes me think about kind of things like Gary's mod, which is a really, really kind of interesting platform. It's published by Valve. RP roleplay servers on Gary's mod are absolutely enormous, and there's some really interesting examples of, and I suppose I'm thinking about this because I was thinking about the ways in which multiplayer communities kind of police themselves or organize themselves within a structure. So I ran a module at Lincoln called Performance in Video Games. I ran it a few times, and one of my students did a really fantastic essay on role-playing servers in Gary's mod, and he did a little bit of a bit of field work. So he went around and spent a lot of time in all of these RP servers and was trying to figure out how it is that when you're role-playing, how do people kind of coalesce into a kind of an organized group of shared objective. And he found that the best one was the Harry Potter RP server, where everyone played as if they were students at Hogwarts. And he said that, there were someone would just take the role of teacher, someone would just kind of step into this space, and they'd start kind of pretending, improvising to learn how to do all of these spells. And I said, okay, well, what is it about this particular server? What are the rules? What are the structures? What are the expectations? They said, oh, they're all on a blackboard in the classroom about how to behave. And I thought that was really interesting, because they're kind of the rules of the behavior are baked in, if you like, that they're kind of diegetic rules. They are on the blackboard in that space, as well as they are circling that space as a participant. So they are visible to your kind of avatar and to you, and it kind of closes the gap between who you're controlling and who you are in that RP space. So when I suppose to answer your question about how might you start to have some of those experiments, maybe it's a platform like Gary's mod, maybe something like that, in terms of how can people reach consensus, kind of respond to particular prompts in particular ways. Maybe it isn't the space that you can de-radicalize anybody. And maybe it's not, as Ashton said, maybe de-radicalization is almost kind of a moot point because it's not possible. But I suppose to go back to that idea of procedure or rhetoric, I suppose what I think is why I think that's so fundamental is that all of these systems, Gary's mod will have things baked into it that will be coded into it that draw parameters to your experience. The Papers, Please is a really good example, and the thing I showed up earlier, where but it's a single player experience. September 12th is a single player experience, and when you were talking about who has control and who doesn't, when you're in a single player experience, even if it's a sandbox experience, one, you're not having to interact with other people, so you're not having to engage in a kind of in a dialogue with them and what they're doing. But a developer is going to be able to control and channel your experience much more heavily. If Papers, Please became if Papers, Please had competitive multiplayer, where suddenly and for anyone who doesn't know, the purpose of the game is to process immigrants into a fictional kind of post-Soviet country, and as a player you get increasingly complex rules that you have to follow each day of the game. And the more you process, the more money you get. You never have enough money to feed your family, to heat your house, to care for your ailing parents. So there's lots of moments where the game asks you to kind of step over a very gentle moral line. Will you just let this person in? You'll get another $5. And you go, oh gosh, well, my kids haven't eaten in 2 days, I need to. And then you might take another step across a moral line, to which point, at one point, you're just kind of letting gun runners in because you're broke. If that was a competitive experience, or if there was a cooperative experience there, that dimension of the game would collapse. Because as you see with, because games become about min-maxing, it becomes about efficiency. How can I do the best thing in the fastest time to get to the top of that leaderboard? How can I beat you? At that point, I think what happens is you get so zoned in on the kind of on what is effectively the maths of an encounter like that any of that kind of moral backdrop becomes a backdrop. It's just behind you, and actually it's all about efficiencies, which is why kind of Grand Theft Auto is really interesting, because the online experience, you can just not do anything in Grand Theft Auto Online. You can just kind of roll around with your friends and, you know, take a bus to the top of a mountain and parachute it to the sea, or kind of do very playful and creative things, but it is a social space that has objectives in them to make them feel like games if you want them to be games, but they're just places to hang out. And I think that's where the interesting content, or that's where the interesting things are happening in terms of those propaganda videos that Ashton was showing us.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. To build, sorry, Ashton.
I was just going to add before. There are actually people trying to do this, so it's an interesting topic of conversation. I know people that are working on this space that are trying to create video games to get into that process, to start the process of radicalization or potentially reverse it. It's just me. I personally don't believe in de-radicalization. I think you can get people to disengage with violence, but I don't think you can ever prove that someone doesn't hold those kind of worldviews anymore. But yes, it is definitely a space that people are, you know, exploring in the counter kind of extremism area.
No, thank you. That's really interesting to know and good to add. To build off what Wes just said, and Ashton, I wonder if you could speak to this a little bit, sort of talking about online GTA becoming a social space and bringing it back to this idea of Wes put it very bluntly, which I thought was really good, and I wrote it down, and I want to make sure that I repeat this properly. Virtual dress up for racists, which I thought was really great. Talking about that in terms of I am a big kind of I don't touch on this subject because I'm not a big fan of VR in certain respects, in that I like live performance, but thinking about VR and like meta and the increasing role that that's possibly going to play in our society, what's your thoughts in terms of how that's going to affect this kind of playing dress up for racists as a performative space, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous. That's just my opinion. I think that with every advancement in technology, you're going to get more and more people that will exploit it for nefarious means. I can only speak to what I've seen myself in terms of the research, and that is that virtual reality offers people a chance. It's not just virtual reality, it's any kind of insidious hidden away forum. It offers people a chance to express views that are completely unacceptable in contemporary social circles. So one of the things that I was really interested in my research is this differentiation between kind of alt-right 4chan circles where you can say anti-immigrant rhetoric and it's considered socially acceptable because we're in an era in which nationalism is rising, and you know, we've had these far-right successes and people are culturally nationalistic now, and that's acceptable. It is still not acceptable to be anti-Semitic, generally overtly racist. So I think that in these communities, they offer these enclosed, safe spaces for these people to be able to express their opinions with virtual friends who feel the same way that they do, because their general human friends will never accept those kind of views. And I think the more that technology enables this to happen, it's much more difficult for researchers or security to infiltrate these spaces. Then you're going to get these clusters of people that will communicate together. And the difficulty is, like I was saying, is differentiating between who actually holds these views and wants to kind of move this virtual reality realm that they've created offline, and who is just pissing about and thinks it's so funny to dress up as a Klans member. Because there's so many people that I've seen that are literally just pissing about constantly. They have like racist handles on GTA, for example, or they're talking about the Klan, or they're mucking about with the Klan on Red Dead Redemption. They think it's funny. They think it's some sort of like weird buzz off of history. What's the difference here between someone that actually thinks these things ideologically and someone that's mucking around? And I think that's the difficulty with gaming, particularly when they offer these spaces where you can perform these roles and there's no clear identification of whether or not you actually believe them, because you can be who you want in video games, right? That's one of the points of it. And they offer all of these roles, and it's only a tiny proportion of the time that it can go south, but I think it can, and it's up to us to kind of try and drag out who might be susceptible to that.
Can I just jump in here? We've just got a question from the chat. I will read out, but it's linked to what I was going to ask as well, because this for me, Ashton, what you've touched on, what both of you have touched on, is how much do the people believe it in what they're doing? But, you know, like, does dressing up in a KKK outfit, do I think Harry is a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer? No, because he goes to a fancy dress party in a Nazi uniform. It's an unethical thing to do. And this thing what you're saying, Ashton, about people just finding it fun, pissing around, that was the thing that was the complete, what I found so disturbing during 2016. And like some people like Milo Yiannopoulos come on, everything's a joke, it's all irony, it's all free speech, you're the snowflakes, blah, blah, blah. But where then should in the age of the metaverse, do we have to start thinking of online gameplay as real politics, as in this is where political discourse is being practiced, and that and which involves a level of imagination and role play? Or should we still talk about it as something that is happening on the margins, where people do have a clear line between their real self and their virtual self? And I'll just read out something Linford's written. And if anyone, by the way, audience, wants to come in, just raise your hand, and I'll put your mic on, or write a question in the chat. It'd be great to get a conversation going. So Linford's written, I think there's an interesting thing here about not only playing a generic type of radicalized figure, such as a Nazi or ISIS militant, but recreating and playing as specific figures from the real world. So I think it's interesting that in an imaginative space with potentially limitless possibility for invention and customization, these users in fact close that down. I wonder if you think of these spaces as prefigurative, that the implication is not just of playing dress, but of mimicry. So anyone wants to come in on Linford's point, or my question around line between real, virtual, etc.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on Linford's point. I think it is really interesting how much mimicry there is, and not even at the, and I don't think this just exists at, for picking out kind of controversial figures. If you look at most recently a game like Elden Ring, which bust avatar creator in there is a subreddit for Elden Ring which is called Elden Ring Sliders, and if you go into Elden Ring Sliders, people will post their kind of numerical values of all their customizable sliders that will show you how to create Samuel L. Jackson, Cristiano Ronaldo, someone from the Blue Man Group, whatever it might be, so that you can play as this famous person that you shouldn't be able to really construct in the game. That's brilliant. Actually, one of the most popular ones, which directly connects to something Ashton was showing us, is Kratos from God of War. The God of War sliders are the most requested ones. Now, that's really interesting because of how much the Kratos avatar taps in, is really, really used quite a lot. I think part of it is genuinely about feeling like you're like, there's an inventive satisfaction at being able to take a bunch of random sliders and suddenly have it look like Will Smith, who was very popular for the last couple of weeks, as you can imagine. Because if you just kind of, or you put all the sliders to the right and you just go really fat with a big white head, and suddenly you've just gone huge. Actually, there's no deftness in it. There's no skill. There is almost an art to be able to be able to control these particular sliders in a way that you're creating a kind of photorealistic representation of somebody, because in a way you almost shouldn't be able to do it, because they're very, they're super advanced, much more advanced now than they were 10 or 15 years ago, but they're a very immense. So there's a showing off that happens. You go, gosh, I managed to make mine look exactly like Boris Johnson. Great, put it on the sliders. And then people will play as that. So I don't think Linford, to your point, and that's not to negate your point at all, because I think there is something really interesting about that tension of, well, you could create whatever you want, within the limits of this framework, and yet here you are kind of picking on pop culture or famous or far right icons. But I think part of it is about play, and about play. I think in that context is successful when someone recognizes the thing that you have attempted to make whilst playing. It's like when you play with Lego and you make, as a child, and you make this kind of awful, sprawling, monstrous thing. And I remember showing these creations to my mum, and I go, what's that? How can you not know what this is? It's a sausage factory. Of course it is. It's got chimneys and pipes and everything. But actually, when it's recognizable, that's where the praise comes from.
I think that's a very key point, particularly when we're talking about like interactive theatre. The sense that for someone to participate meaningfully, they have to understand the rules, like what is the offer and how can they what response is asked of them. And I wonder if there's something around worth thinking about more, the fact that in the West, Western culture is saturated with images of World War II, that we absolutely understand the visual language of that world, to perhaps that's what makes it quite attractive, and the violence as well. And so thinking about how to hack or mod these games for building or reinventing democratic participation is complicated, because there's no visual shorthand, say this is what we're all doing here. It's got to be co-invented with other players. Rachel's asked a question, yes, but is there a degree to which the lulz is part of the procedural rhetoric of 4chan, etc. spaces, i.e. the first person to get offended loses because it's all ironic anyway? How can we know where procedural rhetoric of any given space/world stops and player belief agency begins? That's a much better way of asking my question. Thank you, Rachel.
I think that's so important.
Sorry, Tom, what did you say?
Oh, sorry, that's me chiming in.
I thought you were going to continue your sentence.
No, that was just me. I think that's so important. I think in terms of one of my notes of thinking about what you guys said was about gaming being playful and almost ironic, but then how can it be playful and authentic, I suppose, would be my question to follow up from that, but not to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, 4chan is just a cesspool of I mean, it's one of the worst spaces. 4chan and 8chan for me is just like, it's not funny at all, any of the things that go on in there. I feel like, yeah, this kind of masking behind humor is something that comes up quite often with video games, particularly as it's such a pop culture phenomenon. And I feel like particularly with the 2016 kind of Brexit Trump, it became very like exploiting popular culture, and if you didn't like it, you were woke and you were a snowflake. I mean, God, I've been called every name under the sun. But I feel like with the ways in which they use video games, and that's why I'm so interested in the history of it, because with flat out Nazi dinner parties that, yeah, people could be like, oh, it's so funny, I'm at a Nazi dinner party, I'm part of the Klan, we're burning a cross in Red Dead Redemption 2 or whatever. there's a difference between that and then the ways in which they weaponize the history of video games, which I see much more actually in relation to Chan culture than manipulation of video games for humor to be able to fly under the radar. I feel like the weaponization of history is important because unless you understand how the history is used by the alt-right to convey certain narratives, it can be very easy to fly under the radar of being anything even deemed as offensive. So what you were saying just a minute ago about how do you differentiate between the obsession with World War II? One of the things that I'm really interested in is this kind of fuzzy middle ground between the mainstream and the fringe, and like, when does bunting of a Spitfire become insidious, right? So when are you going to look at something that's like a scone, right? So this whole QAnon, really like getting back traditionalism kind of culture that's come through. What's the difference between a scone and jam and a Spitfire bunting and an extremist, right? So where's the fuzzy line between that? And I feel like video games play this really well. When is it a joke? When is it someone having a laugh? And then when does it become insidious? And I feel like even when it is a joke, you need to get in with your counter narratives and tell people why it's not funny at all, like how offensive it is. When you actually tell people, like, I remember when George Floyd happened and I wrote this article and I was telling people about the history of the Black people love fried chicken stereotype and how it dates back to the birth of a nation and the Klan. And they just have no idea that they're actually disseminating horrendously horrific hate speech in these humorous caricatures about KFC. And I feel like that's where you need to get in with the gaming. Like, it's not funny. Know your history.
Have you seen the HBO series of Watchmen, Ashton?
No, I have not.
I
have watched Hunters on Amazon though.
It's just like this is just a kind of side note, but it opens with the Tulsa massacre in, I think, 1922. I can't remember the exact date. And I thought I was watching fiction when I saw that. I didn't know that was real. And since then, I think it's been put on the school syllabus in Oklahoma. It might have been removed by now, but that was. So I think that's about. I think there's something in what you're saying about the power of art to inform in a very direct, but accessible way. These historical gaps.
Don't you think art? I did a lot of stuff on art and like the sculptures and the statues and how art becomes political lightning rods when it comes to the culture wars, because the art is what people express their true ideological views through and then claim it as art. That's how I feel about something. Yeah.
We've just got a couple more questions, so I just want to make sure we get everyone in. Question from Daniel. That's a point, I think. This has been really interesting and put me in mind of Mary Flanagan's ideas of unplaying in her 2009 book Critical Play, the notion of acting out forbidden scenes. So I wondered if some of these points could be linked into that, although Flanagan is talking more about acts of violence rather than extreme racism or propaganda. Don't know that book. Is anyone familiar with that book? No?
No, but I'll have to look it up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, Daniel. We'll take a look. And then another question in the chat from James. I find it interesting that within theatre, we expect the audience to follow our rules, as you say, Joseph. And in gaming, we have to follow the rules of the game, where we can kill countless scores of digital people with no fault. But then we can apply the notions of race or the far right and manipulate these. That's where we then take issue with these acts. And then the context that comes with the propaganda of it. It makes me think of a mission on Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which you can skip a terrorist act in an airport. I would find it interesting to the extent of a general population, if a general population played the full mission and the demographics of the people who skipped it to just a standard warfare mission.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I was literally just thinking when you started talking, I remember my supervisor telling me that he just walked through the airport. So I didn't shoot anyone. I literally just strolled through the airport. So that's a really interesting question. I have nothing else to say but that, because I've not played it myself, but yeah, it's come up before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The mission is called No Russian. I remember it really clearly. There's been lots and lots of kind of written about No Russian now as a really interesting kind of almost interlude in a game where you, and I suppose it's interesting because you have an option to exercise a kind of agency that you don't anywhere else in the game. You can't get to that stage in the game without engaging in combat, and you do have to kill lots and lots of people, or you're not going to finish the level. You can't. If you just stand there like a pudding with a white flag up, you'll just die like that. That's the game. The game is a armed combat. In No Russian, it doesn't matter what you do, it turns out. So for anyone who doesn't know it, you are walking through an airport, and you basically just start, you and the gang that you are with start opening fire on all of these kind of passengers in an airport terminal. You are undercover and basically attempting to kind of fit in. So yeah, you can fire your gun, you can shoot light fixtures, which is what I did, and kind of shot a plant pot every now and again to make a nice explosion. But there was for me this kind of conflict of, well, I'm not going to do that. And that is a really interesting line. Whether or not the game will permit you to get that to that stage or not, at the point I hit No Russian and I was given a choice, I went, well, I couldn't possibly do that. That's an awful thing to do, in spite of all the other things I've done in the game to this point. And interesting that it sits kind of just after the 2/3 point of the game, there or thereabouts. So you're not dipping your toe into the game for 20 minutes to see if you like it and then finding that mission. You're well in structurally. You're a long way into the game by that point.
Yeah. Well, this has been
that's so interesting in terms of what. Oh, sorry, Joe.
No, go for it, Tom. Go on.
I was just saying, Wes, that's so interesting in terms of what you've been talking about in terms of procedural rhetoric, because I'm thinking about how we then apply that to like a theatre space. How you can use the rules of a game to get people to do certain things, and then what is that line that people will or won't cross is very interesting. So thank you for that.
Sorry, I'm just trying to write to Daniel, trying to multitask here. But look, I think this has been absolutely amazing, and we could go on, but we have to bring us to a close because we're at time. And Wes and Ashton, you have been an incredible panel. This is just an amazing start to this project. So exciting. So if we can give a clap to our panelists, please. Thank you, because me and Tom, that sad sort of reminiscent of COVID clapping. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. Like I said at the start, this is just the first of a webinar series. So our next webinar is on the 11th of May at 6:30, and this is with Malika Cunningham and Aurelian Mondon. And we're going to be talking about the kind of state of democracy post-2008, where it all has gone so very wrong, and where the arts could make a critical intervention. So do join us for that. Do register a place on the Eventbrite. I will tweet out the link and I'll email the link to everyone as well. But all it remains me to say is thank you to Tom, thank you to Wes, thank you to Ashton. Enjoy your bank holiday, everyone, and I will close the chat now. So thank you.